Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1982 horror gem Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, the night no one comes home. Now, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch is one of my all-time favorite horror films. It's actually the first film in the Halloween franchise I saw all the way through. I had seen bits and pieces of the first film on TV, but the first Halloween film that I saw from beginning to end was this film. I checked it out late one night on VHS when I was staying over at my aunt's house, and it really got under my skin. I thought it was a really unnerving, weird, unsettling, fun film, and it wasn't just the Silver Shamrock jingle that left an impression that was ultimately indelible. It was also a lot of the other aspects of the movie, and ever since I've been a huge fan of it. Um, I've always been in the film's corner. I was really baffled by the poor reception when I did research on the film after watching it. I looked it up and saw that it didn't do that well when it came out. I saw that it got mixed reviews from critics. I saw that it got a lot of negative reviews from fans of the franchise, and I didn't get it. I was just completely baffled by all these reviews saying that it sucked and it was terrible. It's one of the worst horror films of the 80s. It was the worst film in the Halloween franchise. And I am really glad to have seen things start to flip when it comes to the way that this film has been received over the years. This film has started to get a much bigger cult following from not only fans of the Halloween franchise, but also fans of the horror genre in general. And it's about time. I'm glad that this is a film that gets the appreciation and respect that it deserves after all these years. It's no longer this redheaded stepchild of the franchise. So, all of that being said, Halloween 3 is one of those movies that I think it's best appreciated as its own film. And that was the intent. This is not a film that's connected to the Michael Myers storyline. Has nothing to do with Laurie Strode. Has nothing to do with Dr. Loomis. It's a standalone film. And this was the direction that John Carpenter wanted to take this franchise in after Halloween 2. Keep in mind, Halloween 2 was a film that John Carpenter never wanted to write, never wanted to do. He had to get drunk one night and write the script for that film. So he didn't really have a lot of passion for that. But what he did have passion for was to take the franchise into a different direction, and instead of doing just a typical stock and slash kind of film all over again, one after another, he wanted to turn the Halloween franchise into a anthology series. I think one of his initial ideas was something involving a ghost story, but then eventually things shifted, and Nigel Neal was brought on board to write a script for Halloween 3, which incorporated the Stonehenge and mystical magic and a lot of other weirdness, and he was brought on because I think John Carpenter himself, or one of the producers, they were big fans of the Quartermass films. And so he was brought on to write Halloween 3 as a result. But something happened where things got lost in translation, or the producers, the studio wasn't really necessarily that happy with what Nigel Neal wrote. So a lot of Nigel Neal's script was ultimately rewritten by Tommy Lee Wallace. And um he's the one that's credited on the film as a result, because he did a lot of the extensive rewrites. There's still a bit of Nigel Neal's work in the finished film, but not a lot of it. The movie that we ultimately got is dramatically different than the one that Nigel Neal had in mind. Now, when it comes to the direction, Tommy Lee Wallace wasn't even the first choice. I mean, this is a guy who had never directed a film prior to Halloween 3, so it made sense that they were like, nah, we don't really want to go with Tommy Lee Wallace. We want to go with a more established veteran director because we're taking this franchise into a new direction and we want to make sure that it's in safe, capable hands. And the studio had Joe Dante in mind, who directed The Howling and Piranha prior to um, being courted for Halloween 3. I think at one point he might have been signed on, but then he ultimately decided to leave the project to go work on the Twilight Zone film and direct a segment for that movie. So that left an opening. The studio, I think it was one of those things where they had a budget, they had everything set up, they had a release date, they needed to get this film done and in the can, so they didn't want to wait any longer. So they ultimately decided to give Tom Lee Wallace a shot, I think based on recommendation from John Carpenter, because Tommy Lee Wallace had worked with Carpenter on a lot of other films that Carpenter directed prior to Halloween 3. So Carpenter felt like he could be a good fit, and the rest is history. And I think Tommy Lee Wallace did a terrific job for a first time filmmaker. You really can't tell that this is a work of a first time director. It has a very capable, strong look and feel throughout visually. There are some genuinely admirable shots and takes throughout the film when it comes to pans, when it comes to angles, when it comes to the way that the camera moves, or establishing shots. Um, there are sequences in this that are a little complex when it comes to all these different things that are going on. Uh, the screen flashing with the pumpkin and the kid freaking out while his head is turning to mush and the parents are wigging out, and it also will cut to Cochrane and Chalice, and they're just watching in horror, or in Cochrane's case, glee, when it comes to what's happening to this poor kid and his family. And there's a lot of moments like that where there are sequences that could be chaotic, could be choppy, and they didn't come across that way at all, despite the fact that Tommy Lee Wallace was a relatively inexperienced filmmaker. I think he also nailed the practical effects when it comes to shooting them properly and making it so they have the right amount of shadows and the right setup so they're not exposed, so they don't look fake in front of the camera. There is one exception, but I don't really think it has anything to do with Tommy Lee Wallace's direction. The whole bit where Cochrane turns silver or whatever, I think that was just a bad effect, and I don't think that had anything to do with the way that Tommy Lee Wallace shot that scene. But yeah, I think it's a well shot film when it comes to the effect sequences. It's a well shot film when it comes to the establishing shots that are trying to create a certain mood and atmosphere. And it also is a film that maintains a consistent tone visually. It doesn't have these jarring moments where the director, because they're a first time filmmaker, is trying to figure out their style. So they just try to do a bunch of different sort of things all at once. And as a result, it's just a mess. But that didn't happen here. Everything was very measured when it comes to the tone and just the overall visuals. It does at times echo Carpenter, but I think that was intentional, and I think it's also the fact that Tommy Lee Wallace worked with Carpenter and was a big fan of his. So I think in some ways some of the sequences in the film that look very Carpenter-esque, I think that was Tommy Lee Wallace's way of showing appreciation and admiration for Carpenter, a colleague and a man that he admired greatly. Now, I can see why some people might think that that might be an instance of Tommy Lee Wallace not really able to find his own style, but I don't really see it that way. I think Tommy Lee Wallace still injected his own signature style into the film, even though it was a little more subtle at times. It was still one of those things where I didn't feel that John Carpenter ghost directed the movie. It felt like it was Tom Lee Wallace's movie. It was his show, and he just did an excellent job. He really wowed me, and I've always been impressed with the direction in this film because it's a very kooky, weird, surreal movie, and it's kind of a film that is difficult to pull off. And I think Tommy Lee Wallace, doing double duty as a writer and a director, just did a admirable and just amazing job working with the film in both capacities. And speaking of the writing, uh, now we are to the point in the video where I'm going to talk about the screenplay. I think the script is, for the most part, relatively spectacular for this kind of film. There are some issues here and there, mainly due to some scenes that drag on a little bit too long because there's too much dialogue, or it's a series of events that could have been ended earlier, or there's some moments that are a little clunky, like the climax in terms of what happens to Conal Cochran, for instance. But other than those few little quibbles, it's a really great script. The overall concept of the film, I think, is brilliant. I think it's a great, ballsy idea to have a film that takes place during Halloween and focuses on this deadly prank on the children of the United States. That's messed up, but it's also really clever. It's really smart. It makes for some really intense, visceral horror. That this seemingly innocuous giveaway at 9, which is set up by this mask making company called Silver Shamrock, has deadly connotations to it and potentially devastating consequences. And I like how the screenplay builds up on things. It doesn't necessarily give away the plan early on. It gives you little bits and pieces of information, and just really creates a great sense of mystery. From the very beginning of the movie, where the guy's running away from these mysterious men in suits, and then he gets killed. Then you have the stuff at the hospital where Dr. Chalice watches this mysterious man douse himself in gasoline and blow himself up. It's one of those things where it's bizarre, it's weird, it takes you off guard, and it just does such a great job maintaining that kind of bizarre, surreal weirdness. With the automaton robot men and suits with orange blood, with the uh, Conal Cochran character and his whole disturbing, just twisted ideals, and how he just takes glee in people's pain, particularly the children, and just how you have these just seemingly harmless Halloween masks and turning them into these really iconic, just incredible vessels of horror. I mean, that whole scene where the poor kid has the jack o' lantern mask on and his head just turns to mush, and then there's all kinds of bugs and snakes and shit pouring out of his uh, dissected and just dis disembodied, not necessarily disembodied, but just completely just flayed open head is the stuff out of nightmares. And even other stuff like when Miss Grimbridge is just messing around with the shamrock tag, and then it's hit in the face with this strange light, and then her face is like ripped open by some mysterious force, and her eyes are all bloodshot and yellow, and then some like giant big ass spider crawls out of her mouth. Yeah, there's just a lot of stuff in this film when it comes to the horror where even though it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of film where it's definitely not taking itself that seriously, it still has moments that really do grab you and really do get under your skin. And I definitely want to give Tommy Lee Wallace a ton of credit for those moments. And I like the fact that it has a different dynamic with these characters. You have Dr. Chalice, who's not a perfect guy. He's a very flawed character. This is a older man who is divorced, or is going through a divorce, has not the best relationship with his significant other. He's trying his best to make it work, but you can tell that there's a lot of uh, fractures along the seams of that relationship. He's an alcoholic. He I think he was an alcoholic, or he might not be an alcoholic, but he's definitely not a saint. And he gets involved with helping this young girl who's trying to look for her missing father, and then he winds up taking her to bed later, and they become an item, or she's a one night stand. And it's one of those things where, yeah, when you really think about it, like Dr. Chalice, he's not the best character when it comes to the integrity of who he is, but he's still a guy who wants to do good. And I think that's what makes him a very compelling character, is that he's flawed, definitely more flawed than a lot of other leads that you can think of, but he has a good moral barometer, and he genuinely wants to do good, and he's willing to sacrifice his own life to do that very thing. He's willing to sacrifice everything to help Ellie. He's willing to give up his life to save the rest of the United States and to save these kids and their parents from this horrific fate when it comes to the big giveaway at 9. And he's willing to go to extreme lengths in order to stop this from happening. So, even though he's got a lot of flaws, he's still ultimately a good man who wants to do the right thing. And I think that's really what makes him a very likable character, is that despite his rough edges, he's still somebody you can relate to and you can root for because of what he's willing to do. And I think Ellie is fine too for what the script gives her. It's not a lot, but there's enough moments where she still holds her own. Conal Cochran is a very weird, just creepy character. He's such a creepy uh guy. It's the type of elder statesman for a company that already on the surface seems like somebody that might be into some stuff on the side that you don't know about, that's a little shady, that's not talked about in the public, but to the extreme, because this man is legitimately a psycho, and he relishes in the pain and destruction of children. And you have a few other characters, but really the main cast of characters is Dr. Chalice, Ellie, and Colonel Cochrane. I mean, you also have like Marge Gutman. You have Linda Chalice, who is Dan's ex-wife or current wife, or it seems like they're definitely on the outs. That's for sure. Um, and you also have the Kupfer family, which are the Buddy and Betty, and Little Buddy. You know, they're the ones that are staying over at the Silver Shamrock facility, and they're getting the tour, and they're the ones that ultimately get the first exposure to the sinister plan of Colonel Cochrane. And speaking of the plan, I really love the ending of this movie. I think it's really quite something else because it's such a unique way to end a film where Dr. Chalice successfully gets the network to take the commercial off the air off the majority of the channels except for one. There's still one more channel. There's no more time left. There's no more time. And it's a very ambiguous ending. Like, you could interpret it that the last channel did get the commercial off the air before the big giveaway and before all these kids died, or you can interpret it the other way, where they weren't able to stop it, and Cochrane's plan worked, and a lot of kids and their parents were sacrificed for the gods. But that's what I like about it, is that it's very ambiguous, but it's also not one of those things where it seems like it can only go one way. So it can only be the bad ending. Like, you can interpret it as Dr. Chalice still found a way to save the day. Um so yeah, ultimately I think it was a really clever, smart script with some really genuinely tense, gripping moments of suspense, some gruesome scenes where people are getting their heads ripped off, jack-o'-lantern masks are turning to mush, and bugs and snakes are crawling out of some poor kid's dead head, and one guy gets his face broken by a robot. And there's just a lot of trippy stuff. I mean, even the twist with Ellie, where at one point she got replaced with a robot, and she's trying to kill Dr. Chalice, and she's like the Terminator. She gets her head knocked off, or her arm ripped off. Her arm is still trying to strangle Dr. Chalice. Her decapitated body is still trying to stumble after him. So yeah, it's a really solid script, and considering that Tommy Lee Wallace had to do a lot of rewrites, it makes it even more impressive when you think about it. And then you have the film's cast, which I think is a great cast. It starts off with Tom Atkins as the lead. Uh, I've always been a big fan of his performance in this film. I think he really showed that he could carry a film on his shoulders here. He has a certain charisma and personality to him that is very strong, and he does a great job playing these rough and tumble kind of characters, these everyman type guys who are not what you would call action heroes, not what you would call the typical hero archetype. This is a guy who's not the best person in the world, has a fair amount of flaws, but still has a lot of admirable traits. And I think Tom Atkins just nailed every aspect of this character. He nailed the flawed aspects of Chalice, as well as he nailed the positive aspects of him, the traits that made Chalice a genuinely likable and strong lead. And it really is just a treat to watch Tom Atkins work in this film as Dr. Chalice. Stacey Nelkin, she was also fine as Ellie. The performance is kind of just there for me. I think she had some good chemistry with Tom Atkins. I don't think the chemistry between her and Tom Atkins is as strong as the chemistry that Tom had with this other actress. I think the character might have been Teddy, but yeah, Teddy, the hospital assistant coroner. Yeah, Teddy, played by Wendy Wessberg. I thought the chemistry between her and Tom was stronger. In fact, honestly, I think it would have been cool to have seen Teddy and Chalice be the ones that were investigating Silver Shamrock together. Um, but that's just me personally, because I really liked Wendy Westberg's performance, and I think it's really underrated. But Stacey Nelkin, she was still fine in the film. Dan O'Harely is an absolute just pleasure to watch when it comes to his maniacally mirthful performance as Colonel Cochran. It's just a really standout performance. You can't take your eyes off the screen when it comes to any scene that he's in. He commands the screen with his presence, his charisma, and just this sadistic glee and just pleasure and joy that he has playing such a evil man. I mean, there's that whole sequence in the film that is definitely one of the most iconic scenes in the movie. And all it is just Dan O'Harely saying lines of dialogue. And it's just so chilling that it freezes your bones. And that just shows you how great of a performance uh, this really is when it comes to Dan O'Harely's performance as Colonel Cochran. I mean, there are scenes with his character that are more blood curdling than anything I've ever seen in any other Halloween film when it comes to Michael Myers stalking and slashing people with a knife. I think it's because of the fact that he is willing to pull such a demented and twisted prank on children. You know, the whole bit where he's like, enjoy the horathon, Doctor. And don't forget to watch the big giveaway afterwards. Why, Cochran? Why? Do I need a reason? Mr. Cupford was right, you know. I do love a good joke. And this is the best ever. A joke on the children. But there's a better reason. You don't really know much about Halloween. You thought no further than the strange custom of having your children wear masks and go out begging for candy. It was the start of the year in our old Celtic lands, and we'd be waiting in our houses of wattles and clay. The barriers would be down, you see, between the real and the unreal, and the dead might be looking in to sit by our fires of turf. Halloween, the festival of Samhain, The last great one took place 3,000 years ago, when the hills ran red with blood of animals and children. Sacrifices was a part of our world, our craft. Witchcraft! To us, a way of controlling our environment. It's not so different now. It's time again. In the end, we don't decide these things, you know? The planets do. They're in alignment. And it's time again. The world's going to change tonight, Doctor. I'm glad you'll be able to watch it. And happy Halloween. I mean, I don't think I did it justice, but like, that is just such a great scene. And it is in many ways only as great as it is because of what Dan O'Harely brings to that role. You also have some other actors and actresses like Michael Currie, who plays a character named Rafferty. You have Ralph Strait, who plays Buddy. Jadeen Barbor, who plays Betty Kupfer. Brad Schacter plays Little Buddy, their kid. Garn Stevens plays Marge Gutman. Nancy Kyes is in this as Linda Chalice. You might recognize Nancy Kyes. She was in The Fog. She was in John Carpenter's Halloween. You have Jonathan Terry, plays a character named Starker. He was Colonel Glover in Return of the Living Dead. And then you also, like I said, you have Wendy Wessberg, who plays Teddy, as well as Al Berry, who plays Harry Grimbridge. And then Dick Warlock, who played Michael Myers in Halloween 2, he's in this as one of the robot assassins. So yeah, it's a really good cast. Of course, headed up by the badass himself, Tom Atkins. The film also features some really just wonderful cinematography by Dean Cundey. I mean, there's some shots in this that I think are just absolutely mesmerizing. The whole shot of Arizona, I think it was like Phoenix, Arizona, at sunset, where the sky is all red and there's all these trick-or-treaters who are shown in shadows while they're like walking up a hill or a mountain. That shot is just phenomenal. And there's a lot of other sequences in this film that are just really well shot and really well done. When it comes to the lighting, when it comes to the framing and everything. Another reason why it looks very Carpenter is Dean Cundey, because Dean Cundey worked with Carpenter for years. But Dean Cundey's a masterful cinematographer, and I think his presence really did help Tommy Lee Wallace be able to do as good of a job as he did with this film, because he had someone else who could be there to lend him a helping hand, give him some advice. So he wasn't just trying to do everything on his own. So I think having Dean Cundey there really was something that helped Wallace get the most out of his effort when it comes to the direction in the movie. It also features some excellent editing by Millie Moore. There's some really great bits of editing when it comes to just cutting back and forth from different sequences and different events. There's a lot of flashing lights, a lot of flashy visuals in this, especially the Silver Shamrock commercial and the flashing like subliminal thing that causes people's heads to melt. And I think with a different kind of edit or a different editor that's not as capable or not as strong, those are other scenes that really could falter without the right person in the booth. And that definitely wasn't the case when it comes to Halloween 3. Now, the film also features a really moody, strong, creepy score by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. It's honestly one of my favorite scores of theirs. Just from the opening credits alone, which I also really love the way it looks with the computer of the pumpkin just forming bit by bit with the sound effects and then the score in the background just does a great job setting the mood for the film. And yeah, this score is just iconic. It's an incredible bit of work by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. And it's only like 98 minutes and it goes by at a relatively quick pace. I mean, there are some moments where it kind of drags a little bit, but that's really mainly due to some of the aspects of the script. Um, Not really anything uh, extra, but even those elements and even those moments where it slows down a bit aren't enough to really affect the uh, entertainment value of the film that strongly. Like, it's not a movie that I watch that there's a moment where it slows down so much that I'm just bored by it. It's just there are certain scenes in the film that are a little bit more slow. They don't have a lot going on, so they're not as interesting or as fun to watch as other sequences in the movie. And it was a relatively low budget film, like 2.5 million. So it's not like it was a big budget affair. And I think everyone involved did a good job working within the constraints of that budget and still delivering a really effective, chilling, surreal, classic horror film. And for whatever reason, it just didn't do that well. I think it only made like 14 million in the US. Critics were mixed on it, and it just didn't start a new trend for this franchise. And as much as I like Halloween 4, I think it would have been interesting to have seen more of these standalone anthology films when it comes to the Halloween franchise, especially if one of them was directed by John Carpenter. Can you imagine a ghost story directed by John Carpenter? I mean, you already had something like that with The Fog, but a different kind of ghost story, like a haunted house film directed by John Carpenter. That could have been really interesting. But wasn't meant to be. This ultimately was a franchise that shifted its focus back on Michael Myers and Dr. Loomis. And to me personally, to mixed results. And I think if this franchise continued with the anthology route, that would also happen too eventually. But I think there would just be more avenues creatively that the franchise could have gone to that I think would have been fascinating. But it is what it is. Things just weren't meant to be, and I'm glad that we at least got this one off. We got this unique oddity of a film in Halloween 3. Um, so yeah, I really don't know what else to say about Halloween 3 Season of the Witch except thanks for watching my review, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.